Thereupon our heroine resumed her walk. Tears, blinding tears, were running down her face. She knew that it was all sentiment, all baseless impressibility, which had caused her to read the scene as to her own condemnation. Nevertheless, she could not get over it. She could not contravene in her own defenceless person all those untoward omens. It was impossible to think of returning to the vicarage. Angel's wife felt almost as if she had been hounded up that hill like a scorned thing by those, to her, superfine clerics. Innocently as the slight had been inflicted, it was somewhat unfortunate that she had encountered the sons and not the father, who, despite his narrowness, was far less starched and ironed than they, and had to the full the gift of charity. As she again thought of her dusty boots, she almost pitied those habiliments for the quizzing to which they had been subjected, and felt how hopeless life was for their owner. "Ah," she said, still sighing in pity for herself, "they don't know that I wore those over the roughest part of the road to save these pretty ones he bought for me. No, they did not know it, and they didn't think that he chose the colour of my pretty frock. No, how could they? If they had known, perhaps, they would not have cared, for they don't care much for him, poor thing." Then she grieved for the beloved man whose conventional standard of judgment had caused her all these latter sorrows, and she went her way without knowing that the greatest misfortune of her life was this feminine loss of courage at the last and critical moment through her estimating her father-in-law by his sons. Her present condition was precisely one which would have enlisted the sympathies of old Mr. and Mrs. Clare. Their hearts went out of them at a bound towards extreme cases, when the subtle mental troubles of the less desperate among mankind failed to win their interest or regard. In jumping at publicans and sinners, they would forget that a word might be said for the worries of scribes and Pharisees, and this defect or limitation might have recommended their own daughter-in-law to them at this moment as a fairly choice sort of lost person for their love. Thereupon she began to plod back along the road by which she had come, not altogether full of hope, but full of a conviction that a crisis in her life was approaching. No crisis apparently had supervened, and there was nothing left of her to do but to continue upon that starve-acre farm till she could again summon courage to face the vicarage. She did indeed take sufficient interest in herself to throw up her veil on this return journey, as if to let the world see that she could at least exhibit a face such as Mercy Chant could not show. But it was done with a sorry shake of the head. "It is nothing, it is nothing," she said. "Nobody loves it, nobody sees it. Who cares about the looks of a castaway like me?" Her journey back was rather a meander than a march. It had no sprightliness, no purpose, only a tendency. Along the tedious length of Benville Lane she began to grow tired, and she leant upon gates and paused by milestones. She did not enter any house till, at the 7th or 8th mile, she descended the steep long hill below which lay the vicarage or townlet of Evershed, where in the morning she had breakfasted with such contrasting expectations. The cottage by the church, in which she again sat down, was almost the first at that end of the village, and while the woman fetched her some milk from the pantry, Tess, looking down the street, perceived that the place seemed quite deserted. "The people are gone to the afternoon service, I suppose," she said. "No, my dear," said the old woman. "'Tis too soon for that. The bells hain't shook out yet. They be all gone to hear the preaching in yonder barn. A ranter preaches there between the services, an excellent fiery Christian man, they say, but Lord, I don't go to hearing. What comes in the regular way over the pulpit is hot enough for I." Tess soon went onward into the village. her footsteps echoing against the houses as though it was a place of the dead. Nearing the central part, her echoes were intruded on by other sounds, and seeing the barn not far off the road, she guessed these to be the utterances of the preacher. His voice became so distinct in the still clear air that she could soon catch his sentences, though she was on the closed side of the barn. The sermon, as might be expected, was of the extremest antinomian type, on justification by faith, as expounded in the theology of St. Paul. This fixed idea of the rhapsodist was delivered with animated enthusiasm, in a manner entirely declamatory, for he had plainly no skill as a dialectician. Although Tess had not heard the beginning of the address, she heard what the text had been from its constant iteration. "O fool Galatians, who hath bewitched you, that ye should not obey the truth, before whose eyes Jesus Christ hath been evidently set forth, crucified among you?" Tess was all the more interested, as she stood listening behind, in finding that the preacher's doctrine was of a vehement form of the view of Angel's father, and her interest intensified when the speaker began to detail his own spiritual experiences of how he had come by those views. He had, he said, been the greatest of sinners. He had scoffed, he had wantonly associated with the reckless and the lewd. But a day of awakening had come, and in a human sense it had been brought about mainly by the influence of a certain clergyman whom he had at first grossly insulted, but whose parting words had sunk into his heart and had remained there till, by the grace of heaven, they had worked this change in him and made him what they saw him. But more startling to Tess than the doctrine had been the voice, which, impossible as it seemed, was precisely that of Alec d'Urberville. Her face fixed in painful suspense, she came round to the front of the barn and passed before it. The low winter sun beamed directly upon the great double-doored entrance on this side, one of the doors being open, so that the rays stretched far in over the threshing floor to the preacher and his audience, all snugly sheltered from the northern breeze. The listeners were entirely villagers, among them being the man whom she had seen carrying the red paint-pot on a formal memorable occasion. But her attention was given to the central figure, who stood upon some sacks of corn, facing the people and the door. The 3 o'clock sun shone full upon him, and the strange enervating conviction that her seducer confronted her, which had been gaining ground in Tess ever since she had heard his words distinctly, was at last established as a fact indeed. End of chapter 44 and end of phase the 5th.